February 22nd, 1944, North Atlantic, 400 miles southwest of Iceland. The sea was black glass that morning, stretched flat beneath a sky the color of old steel. No wind, no swell. Just the kind of silence that made a sailor's skin crawl, the kind that preceded wolves. Aboard the USS Buckley, a destroyer escort barely 6 months off the shipyard, Ensign Robert Williams stood at the starboard rail and watched the fog roll in like ash from some distant cremation. The air tasted of salt and diesel. The temperature hovered just above freezing, cold enough that every breath came out white, every metal surface burned to touch. Somewhere beneath that lifeless surface, something was watching them back. The convoy they were escorting, 32 merchant vessels carrying grain, ammunition, and fresh troops to Britain, had been steaming in nervous formation for 11 days. 11 days without incident. But the men knew. They had all heard the stories by then. Stories of ships split open in the night, of men swallowed by burning oil, of lifeboats found empty, rocking in circles under an indifferent moon. The U-boats were out there, always out there. And in the winter of 1944, they were hunting closer to American shores than ever before. Williams lit a cigarette with shaking hands. He was 23 years old. He had never killed anyone. His father had fought in the First World War, had come home missing 3 fingers and most of his hearing, and had told young Robert that war was not glory, but butchery dressed in medals. Williams had joined anyway, because what choice did his generation have? The world was burning, and someone had to carry water. Within 6 hours, he would help sink a German submarine with his bare hands. The war beneath the waves had begun long before America entered the fight. By the time the first U.S. destroyer escort slid down the slipway in 1943, German U-boats had already sent over 2,000 Allied ships to the bottom of the Atlantic. Admiral Karl Dönitz, commander of the Kriegsmarine submarine fleet, had perfected what he called Rudeltaktik, wolfpack tactics, coordinate strikes, overwhelm the escorts, bleed the convoys dry. For 2 years, it worked with devastating efficiency. The waters off the American East Coast became known as the Second Happy Time among German submariners, a killing field so rich with targets that U-boat captains spoke of it the way hunters spoke of Eden. Between January and August 1942, nearly 400 ships were sunk within sight of American beaches. Bodies washed ashore in Virginia. Oil slicks blackened the sands of Florida. And every night, coastal residents could see the orange glow of burning tankers on the horizon. The American Navy had been caught unprepared. Too few escorts, inadequate training, no coordinated doctrine. Merchant sailors called the early convoy routes Torpedo Junction and the Graveyard. Some refused to sail. Others wrote final letters home before boarding, kissing their wives and children goodbye with the knowledge that the odds of survival were less than even. But by 1944, the tide was turning. New technology, sonar, radar, high-frequency direction finding, depth charges with improved fusing, and the Hedgehog forward-throwing mortar had begun to tip the scales. More than that, the Americans had learned to fight back with something the Germans hadn't anticipated: recklessness. Not the chaotic kind, but the calculated, cold-blooded recklessness of men who had been told their enemy was invincible and decided to prove otherwise. They called it aggressive escort tactics. The Germans called it madness. The Buckley was part of that new breed. A cannon-class destroyer escort, 306 feet long, displacing 1/400 tons, armed with 3 3-inch guns, torpedo tubes, depth charge racks, and a crew of 186 men who had trained together for only 8 weeks before being thrown into the meat grinder. Her captain, Lieutenant Commander Brent Abel, was 31 years old and had never commanded a warship before. Before the war, He had taught mathematics at a high school in Ohio, but he had read everything ever written about anti-submarine warfare, every after-action report, every tactical study, every classified memo from the Admiralty, and he had developed a theory, one his superiors called insane. If you corner a U-boat, Abel had told his officers during their first briefing in Boston Harbor, don't circle and drop charges like everyone else. Ram the bastard. Get so close he can't dive, can't maneuver, can't think. Make him believe you've lost your mind. Because a panicked enemy makes mistakes, and mistakes get them killed. The officers had exchanged glances. One, Lieutenant J.G. Marcus Chen, had asked the obvious question. Sir, ramming a U-boat would likely cripple our own ship. We might sink alongside them. Abel had smiled, though there was no warmth in it. Then we better make sure we sink them first. No one believed he would actually do it. The sonar contact came at 13:47 hours, a faint ping, barely distinguishable from the ambient noise of the convoy's propellers and the creak of merchant hulls plowing through cold water. Sonarman Second Class Eugene Hicks leaned into his headset, closed his eyes, and listened with the concentration of a priest at confession. He had been trained to distinguish between schools of fish, thermal layers, wreckage, and the unmistakable acoustic signature of a German Type 9 U-boat. There, again. A metallic echo, slow and deliberate, moving left to right across their bow at a depth of approximately 200 feet. Contact, bearing 035, range 1,800 yards, Hicks reported, his voice flat and professional, despite the adrenaline now flooding his bloodstream. His mouth had gone dry. His hands were steady. Abel was on the bridge in seconds, his boots clanging on the steel ladder. He studied the sonar plot with the intensity of a man reading his own death warrant. The U-boat was deep, running slow, trying to slip beneath the convoy undetected like a shark beneath a raft. Standard procedure would be to alert the other escorts, coordinate a search pattern, drop a spread of depth charges in a predetermined grid, and hope for the best. Hope that one of the 600-pound charges would detonate close enough to rupture the pressure hull. Hope that the U-boat commander would panic and surface. Hope that luck, for once, would favor the convoy. Abel gave a different order. All ahead flank. Come right to 035. Load hedgehogs, battle stations, sound general quarters. The alarm shrieked through the ship like a wounded animal. Men scrambled from bunks, mess tables, latrines, letters half written, coffee half drunk. Damage control parties sealed hatches. Gun crews loaded shells with mechanical precision born of endless drills. The Buckley surged forward, her turbines screaming, her wake boiling white behind her, throwing up walls of spray that froze on the rails. Down below, in the stifling heat of the engine room, Chief Machinist's mate Thomas O'Brien watched the steam pressure gauges climb into the red zone and whispered a prayer to St. Christopher. The engines were rated for 22 knots maximum sustained speed. Abel was demanding 24. The turbines howled. The hull vibrated like a tuning fork. The U-boat, U-66, under the command of Oberleutnant Zursee Gerhard Seehausen, realized too late that it had been detected. Seehausen was a veteran, 21 patrols, 11 confirmed kills, holder of the Iron Cross First Class. He knew the playbook better than his own heartbeat. Go deep. Go silent. Wait for the destroyers to lose contact in the thermal layers where cold water met warm, where sonar beams bent and scattered like light through a prism. But something was wrong. The contact wasn't circling. It wasn't probing. It was accelerating, closing the distance at a speed that made no tactical sense. Dive! Emergency dive! Take her to 250 meters. Seehausen's voice cracked through the submarine's humid interior, where 50 men breathed the same recycled air and tried not to think about the crushing pressure just beyond the steel walls. But the Buckley was already on top of them. At 600 yards, Abel gave the order to fire hedgehogs. 24 projectile bombs launched in an arc ahead of the ship, each weighing 65 pounds, each armed with a contact fuse that would detonate only upon striking a submarine's hull. It was a new weapon, temperamental and untested. Half the captains in the Atlantic Fleet didn't trust it. The weapons hit the water in a neat spread, sinking fast, tracing invisible arcs through the black water toward where the U-boat should be. The crew held their breath. Williams, now manning a machine gun mount on the starboard side, counted seconds. 10, 20, 30, nothing. No explosions, no debris, no oil slick boiling to the surface. The U-boat had evaded, slipping through the pattern like smoke through fingers. But Abel wasn't finished. He had studied the patrol reports from every U-boat kill in the Atlantic. He knew that a panicked U-boat commander, running low on battery power and with his air growing foul from carbon dioxide buildup, had two choices: dive deeper and risk crushing depth, or attempt to surface and fight it out with the deck gun. Seehausen, with U-66's batteries showing less than 40% charge, and his engineer reporting that the carbon dioxide scrubbers were failing, chose the latter. Better to die under open sky than suffocate in a steel coffin at the bottom of the ocean. At 14:09 hours, U-66 broke the surface 400 yards off the Buckley's starboard beam. Water streamed off its gray hull like the back of some prehistoric leviathan rising from the depths. The conning tower emerged first, then the forward deck, then the aft section with its deck gun already swinging toward the American destroyer. What happened next defied every rule in the Naval War College manual, every doctrine hammered into officer candidates at Annapolis, every lesson learned from 3 years of brutal warfare in the North Atlantic. Abel saw the submarine's conning tower emerge. He saw the deck gun crew scrambling topside, preparing to fire. He saw German sailors in their leather jackets and white-topped caps moving with trained efficiency. And in that instant, that fraction of a second, when most captains would have ordered evasive maneuvers or opened fire with the main battery, he made a decision that would either save his crew or kill them all. Hard right rudder, all ahead flank, ram them. The helmsman, Seaman First Class Arthur Knispel, a farm boy from Wisconsin who had never seen the ocean before joining the Navy, hesitated for only a fraction of a second. His training screamed that this was suicide. His hands moved anyway. He spun the wheel hard over. The Buckley turned like a bull toward a matador's cape, her bow slicing the water at 24 knots, closing the distance in seconds. 400 yards, 300, 200. The German gunners froze, disbelieving. No destroyer did this. No captain was this reckless. One German sailor, Obergefreiter Hans Müller, later recalled in Allied interrogation that his first thought was that the American captain had been killed and the ship was out of control. But Abel was very much in control. The collision was not a glancing blow. It was a thunderclap of steel on steel, a grinding, shrieking impact that shook both vessels to their keels and could be heard by every ship in the convoy. The Buckley's bow struck U-66 just aft of the conning tower, crushing the pressure hull inward by nearly 3 feet, sending German sailors sprawling across the deck. The destroyer's forward momentum drove the submarine sideways, pinning it against the surface like a wolf in a bear trap, preventing it from diving, preventing it from maneuvering, locking the two vessels together in a deadly embrace. For a moment, a single frozen moment that seemed to stretch into eternity, the two vessels were locked together, grinding, scraping, their hulls screaming, both crews staring at each other across 30 feet of churning water. American sailors looked into German faces. German sailors looked back. And then the spell broke. The Germans opened fire first. Machine gun bullets raked the Buckley's superstructure, clanging off steel plates, shattering windows on the bridge, punching through the thin aluminum of ventilation ducts. The destroyer's 3-inch guns couldn't depress low enough to fire back. They were designed for aircraft and surface targets, not for an enemy pressed against their own hull. So the crew improvised. They threw everything they had: empty shell casings, still hot from the Hedgehog launchers, coffee mugs, heavy ceramic Navy issue, wrenches from the damage control lockers, spanners, hammers. One sailor, gunner's mate 3rd class James Riley, grabbed a Thompson submachine gun from the weapons locker and emptied an entire 50-round magazine into the U-boat's conning tower at point-blank range, the muzzle flash lighting up his face like a camera bulb. Another, boatswain's mate 2nd class Frank DeMarco, hurled a Coke bottle, a green glass bottle of Coca-Cola, delivered in a care package from his mother in Brooklyn just 2 weeks earlier, and watched it arc through the air and shatter against a German sailor's forehead, dropping him like a puppet with cut strings. Hand grenades followed. Someone threw a life preserver. Another threw a tin of baked beans. The deck of the Buckley became a riot of improvised violence, sailors fighting with whatever came to hand, screaming and cursing and throwing and shooting until their arms ached and their throats were raw. It was chaos. It was madness. It was hand-to-hand combat between a warship and a submarine, a form of warfare that no one had planned for, no one had trained for, a collision of desperation and fury that would never be repeated in the history of naval combat. On the U-boat, Seehausen realized his boat was finished. The pressure hull was breached. Water was flooding the forward torpedo room at a rate of hundreds of gallons per minute. His engineer, Oberleutnant Klaus Hartmann, reported that the batteries were cracked and leaking chlorine gas, that men were already vomiting and gasping in the aft compartments. He had 2 choices: scuttle the boat and surrender, or go down fighting and take the American destroyer with him. For a long moment, Seehausen considered ramming the torpedo firing button. U-66 still had 1 eel loaded in Tube 3. At this range, he couldn't miss. But the torpedo would destroy both vessels, would kill every man on both crews, would accomplish nothing except adding a few more names to the long list of the dead. He chose surrender. Abandon ship. All hands. Abandon ship! His voice echoed through the intercom, flat and empty. At 14:22 hours, U-66 began her final dive. Not under power, but under the weight of the sea flooding her compartments. Her stern lifted first, propellers still spinning uselessly in the air. Then the bow tipped down, and she slid beneath the surface with a long, hissing sigh, like some great beast finally releasing its breath. Seehausen stood on the conning tower as the water rose around his legs, then his waist, then his chest. He saluted, one final gesture to a navy and a nation that no longer existed in any meaningful sense, and let the water close over his head. The Buckley pulled 36 men from the sea. Seehausen was not among them. The Americans who survived that day would carry it with them forever, not as a triumph, but as a revelation. Ensign Williams, who had stood at the rail that morning fearing he would never have the courage to fight, spent 3 hours pulling German sailors from the water. His hands were raw and bleeding by the end. Some of the Germans were younger than him, boys conscripted at 17 and sent to sea with 6 weeks of training. Some were crying, great racking sobs that shook their bodies as they clung to cargo nets and rope ladders. One, a boy no older than 19 with blonde hair plastered to his skull, clutched a small photograph. His mother, his sister, standing in front of a farmhouse somewhere in Bavaria, smiling in the sunshine of a world that no longer existed. The boy's hands were shaking so violently he couldn't hold it. Williams held it for him, kept it dry, and the boy whispered Danka before passing out from hypothermia. Williams kept that photograph. He kept it through the rest of the war, through the invasion of Normandy, where he transferred to a destroyer that bombarded Utah Beach, through the liberation of the camps where he saw things that broke something inside him that never fully healed, through the victory parades and the long silence that followed. He kept it in his wallet until the day he died in 1987, and his daughter found it among his effects and wondered why her father had carried a picture of strangers for 43 years. He kept it because it reminded him of something he had learned that day in the North Atlantic, something that couldn't be found in any tactical manual or propaganda film or victory speech. War was not an abstraction. It was not flags and speeches and distant explosions on a newsreel. It was two men, freezing in the same water, clinging to the same piece of wreckage, staring at each other and realizing they were both terrified, both exhausted, both human, both far from home, both wondering if they would ever see their mothers again. The Germans who were pulled aboard the Buckley expected to be executed. That was the rumor spread by German propaganda, that the Americans took no prisoners, that they shot survivors in the water like seals, that they were as brutal as the worst of the SS, that their democracy was a lie covering savagery. But instead, the Americans gave them blankets, hot coffee, cigarettes, Lucky Strikes, and Camels. American tobacco that tasted like luxury to men who had been smoking ersatz German cigarettes made from cabbage leaves and sawdust. A Navy corpsman named Luis Perez, whose grandparents had fled fascism in Spain, set broken bones and bandaged wounds and administered morphine without asking which side they had fought for, treating each man with the same care he would have given his own crewmates. One German sailor, Maschinenmat Klaus Fischer, later wrote in his memoir, published in 1972, "I had been told the Americans were soft, decadent, that they could not endure hardship, could not fight without overwhelming material advantage, that they were mongrels and cowards." But the man who pulled me from the water, a black sailor whose name I never learned, had arms like steel cables and eyes that had seen things I could not imagine. And when I thanked him in broken English, he smiled, not with cruelty or triumph, but with something like sadness, and said, "War's over for you, buddy. You're going home." And I realized that I'd been lied to about everything. Fisher survived the war. He returned to Germany in 1946, became a teacher in Hamburg, and spent the rest of his life telling his students that the greatest weapon the Allies possessed was not their ships or their planes or their atomic bombs, but their capacity for mercy. Their ability to hate the enemy and still see the human being, to fight with everything they had and still remember that the man drowning in front of you was someone's son. The Buckley's ramming attack became legend. It was one of only two recorded instances in World War II of a surface ship successfully ramming and sinking a U-boat while both vessels survived the encounter. The Navy awarded Lieutenant Commander Abel the Navy Cross. Every man aboard received a commendation. Newspapers across America ran headlines celebrating the Madman captain and his suicide charge. Hollywood wanted to make a movie. Abel refused every interview. In private, he told friends that he had not been brave. He had been desperate. The U-boat had been seconds away from launching a torpedo spread into the convoy, seconds away from sinking a troop ship carrying 2,000 soldiers to England. There had been no time for procedure, no time for caution, no time for the careful ballet of ASW doctrine. There had been only instinct and the terrible clarity that comes when there are no good choices, only necessary ones. Only the choice between watching men die or risking everything to save them. Years later, historians would debate whether Abel's action was brilliant or reckless, whether it should be taught at the Naval Academy as an example of aggressive tactics or condemned as a violation of sound doctrine that succeeded only through luck. But the men who were there never debated it. They knew what they had seen. They had seen a captain willing to sacrifice his ship to save a convoy. They had seen gunners throwing Coke bottles because they had run out of ammunition and their training had run out, and all that was left was the primal human instinct to survive. They had seen enemies become prisoners, and prisoners become men, and men become brothers in the most unlikely circumstances imaginable. And they had seen, in the wreckage and the screaming and the blood-soaked water, the fundamental difference between a military that fought for conquest and a military that fought for survival. Between a navy that sent boys to die in steel coffins and a navy that pulled those boys from the water and gave them coffee. There is a photograph taken 3 days after the battle when the convoy reached Liverpool that hangs today in the Naval History and Heritage Command Archive in Washington, D.C. It shows the crew of the Buckley assembled on deck, battered and exhausted, their uniforms still stained with salt and oil and blood. Bandages visible on a dozen men. In the front row, hands clasped behind his back, stands Lieutenant Commander Abel. His face is unreadable, neither proud nor ashamed, just tired. Behind him, barely visible in the background, is a stack of empty Coca-Cola bottles, 48 of them, lined up like soldiers along the starboard rail. They had been thrown during the fight, every single one. And when the battle was over, when the adrenaline had faded and the shaking had begun, the crew had gone back and collected them, one by one, fishing them out of corners and lockers and the scuppers, and arranged them in neat rows on the deck. Not as a joke, not as a trophy, but as a symbol of the abundance they had been raised with, the casual, thoughtless abundance that allowed a sailor to carry a glass bottle of soda across an ocean and throw it at an enemy without a second thought. The kind of abundance that spoke louder than any propaganda, any ideology, any promise of a 1,000-year Reich. Because the Germans who survived U-66 would return to a nation where there was no coffee, no chocolate, no Coca-Cola, where cities were rubble and children dug through garbage for potato peels, where the machinery of war had consumed everything, the factories, the farms, the future, and left behind only ash and trauma and the bitter knowledge of defeat. But the Americans? They would go home to a country that could afford to ship soda to the front lines, that could afford to pull enemies from the water and give them cigarettes, that could afford to fight a war on 2 fronts, supply 24 allied nations, build 300,000 aircraft and 2,700 ships, and still have enough left over to rebuild the world when it was over. That could afford to be merciful, because mercy was not a luxury, but a choice. And they chose it every day, in 1,000 small ways that added up to something the fascists could never understand. That was the madness. Not the ramming, not the hand-to-hand combat, but the sheer, incomprehensible madness of a nation so rich, so powerful, so ideologically committed to the belief that every life mattered, even enemy lives, that it would risk its own ships, its own men, to prove that mercy was not weakness, that humanity was not a liability, that you could fight with everything you had and still remember what you were fighting for. Epilogue. On a cold morning in February, in a stretch of ocean where nothing grows and nothing lives except the things that hunt in darkness, 2 machines of war collided. One sank into the black water, taking secrets and stories that would never be told. One survived, limping back to port with a crushed bow and a crew that would never be the same. And in the moment between impact and surrender, 36 men learned that the true weapon of democracy is not its guns or its ships or its industrial might, but its refusal to become the monster it fights. Its insistence that the enemy drowning in front of you is still a human being. That war does not excuse atrocity. That victory means nothing if you lose yourself in the pursuit of it. The U-boat war would continue for another 15 months. Thousands more would die in the cold Atlantic, in the Mediterranean, in the Pacific. But the men who floated in that black water on February 22nd, 1944, enemy and ally alike, predator and prey, victor and vanquished, carried with them the knowledge that the outcome was never in doubt. Not because of superior tactics or technology, but because one side had learned to fight without losing its humanity, had learned that the opposite of fascism was not merely democracy, but compassion, mercy, the radical belief that your enemy's life has value even when he is trying to kill you. And in the end, that was the only victory that mattered. The empty Coke bottles remained on the Buckley's deck for the rest of the war. No one ever threw them away. When the ship was decommissioned in 1946 and sold for scrap, a sailor named Dennis O'Malley took one home to Boston. It sat on his mantle for 60 years, a green glass reminder that sometimes the smallest things, a photograph, a blanket, a bottle of soda, carry more weight than all the weapons in the world. His grandson still has it today.